I never thought I'd be facing my own husband in court, watching him smirk as his lawyer demanded our family estate and $8.5 million in compensation for his contributions to our marriage. After 15 years together, David had transformed from the man who promised to love me forever into someone I barely recognized, a stranger determined to take everything my grandfather had built. The judge looked tired that day, having heard countless divorce cases just like ours. Or so he thought. What no one in that courtroom knew was that I'd spent the last 3 months preparing for this moment. While David had been draining our joint accounts and hiding assets, I'd been quietly gathering evidence, following a paper trail that led to a single document. When I finally handed that folder to the judge, the color drained from David's face. He knew exactly what it contained, and within minutes, so did everyone else. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't when I finally spoke the truth that had been buried for nearly a decade. My family's roots in Massachusetts go back 5 generations. My grandfather, Harold Mitchell, started with a small hardware store in the 1950s and built it into Mitchell Construction, one of the largest commercial contractors in New England. Mitchell women are steel wrapped in silk, my grandmother used to say. I never fully understood that until I needed to be. Growing up in Brookline, I was the awkward middle child between 2 confident brothers. While they followed my father into the business, I was drawn to architecture, designing spaces rather than building them. My father called it pretty drawing and insisted real money was in development. When I won a scholarship to Rhode Island School of Design, he dismissed it as arts and crafts school. I went anyway, working 3 jobs to cover expenses beyond tuition. At family gatherings, especially the annual 4th of July barbecue at our Cape Cod summer home, Dad would introduce my brothers as the future of Mitchell Construction, while I was just our Caroline, still figuring things out. The summer after my junior year, I designed a boathouse for the property. I spent weeks on the plans, even calculating costs to show him I understood the business side. When I presented it at dinner, he glanced at my drawings and said, "Honey, leave the real building to the boys. You'll get married soon enough anyway." My mother squeezed my hand under the table. Later, she whispered, "He doesn't know how to connect with a daughter. Be patient with him." But patience wasn't healing the rift. The complicated turning point came when Grandfather Harold died my senior year. He left the bulk of his estate to my father, but specified that the Cape House and a significant trust, the Mitchell Family Heritage Trust, be placed in my name when I turned 30. Caroline has the Mitchell vision, his will stated. My father was furious, my brothers confused, and I was overwhelmed by my grandfather's unexpected faith in me. Dad didn't speak to me for months. When he finally did, it was to inform me he'd hired David Spencer, a promising young financial advisor, to manage the trust properly until I was mature enough to handle it. "At least your grandfather's poor judgment won't bankrupt the family," he said. I was 23, newly graduated, and unsure of myself despite my degree. When David and I met to discuss the trust, he was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely impressed by my portfolio. "You have a remarkable spatial intelligence," he said, the first time anyone in the financial world had valued my perspective. Within a year, we were dating. By 26, we were married in that same Cape House, with my father finally smiling and telling guests how David had brought Caroline into the real world. I was too in love to see how that stung. For our wedding gift, my father announced he was adding David to the Mitchell Construction Board of Directors. "Now we finally have someone with financial sense in the family," he toasted at our reception, while my mother tried to smooth things over with a speech about different kinds of intelligence bringing strength to a family. Those early years with David were good. He respected my career as I established my own small architectural firm specializing in sustainable design. We renovated the Cape House together, blending my vision with practical considerations. I became pregnant with our daughter Emma in our 3rd year of marriage, and shortly after, my grandfather's trust fully matured into my control. What no one knew, what I didn't discover until years later, was that David had been preparing for this moment since the day my father hired him. The grand gesture came on my 31st birthday when David surprised me with plans for a family compound on the Cape property, additional structures that would bring the whole Mitchell family together again. "Your grandfather wanted you to carry on the family legacy," he said, "and this is how we'll honor him." I was touched, believing he understood what reconciliation with my father would mean to me. The secret, the one that would eventually shock everyone in that courtroom, began taking shape that very night as I signed the documents David presented as just formalities for the construction loans, never suspecting I was signing away pieces of my inheritance in the process. The annual Mitchell family Thanksgiving at the Cape House had become a tradition that I dreaded and cherished in equal measure. Last November marked our 15th anniversary, and I was determined to make it special despite the growing distance between David and me. He'd been traveling extensively for board meetings and investment opportunities, often unreachable for days. When home, he was constantly on his phone, stepping outside for calls and growing irritable when I asked questions. I threw myself into preparing the perfect holiday, hiring local caterers from Barnstable, arranging for Emma's favorite pumpkin centerpieces, and even inviting my father's new wife, Judith, who was closer to my age than his and had never warmed to me. For weeks, I planned every detail while trying to ignore the late-night emails I'd glimpsed on David's laptop and the unfamiliar cologne that sometimes clung to his shirts. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I received a call from Marianne, my college roommate, who had become a corporate attorney in Boston. We met occasionally for lunch, but her tone was unusually serious. "Caroline, I need to see you today, not by phone, in person." We met at a small cafe in Cambridge, far from any Mitchell construction connections. She slid a folder across the table. "A client came to our firm for help with acquisition documents. I recognized the property addresses immediately," she said. "Caroline, someone's selling parcels of the Cape property and some of the trust holdings. The signatures, they look like yours, but something felt off." My hands shook as I opened the folder. There were dozens of transfer documents, all with my signature, except I had never seen them before. "This isn't possible," I whispered. "The trust is ironclad. My grandfather had it structured specifically so the properties couldn't be broken apart." "There are ways around everything," Marianne said quietly, "especially when you have inside access." I spent the next 72 hours in a daze, secretly contacting the trust attorney while continuing Thanksgiving preparations. By Wednesday evening, when David arrived with my brothers and their families, I had confirmed the worst. Nearly 60% of my trust assets had been liquidated or transferred through a complex web of shell companies that all led back to one entity, Spencer Holdings, LLC. That evening, as everyone gathered for drinks on the deck overlooking the bay, my father pulled me aside. "Your husband's a financial genius," he said, his scotch sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. "The board's voting next week on his proposal to expand Mitchell Construction internationally. He's finally bringing this family into the big leagues." "That's wonderful," I managed, wondering if my father was involved or just another pawn. During dinner, David stood to make a toast. Handsome in his cashmere sweater, he raised his glass. "To the Mitchells, who welcomed me as a son and brother, and to new beginnings. I'm excited to announce that construction on the Mitchell family compound begins next spring." Everyone applauded while I froze, forks suspended mid-air. "What compound?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the congratulations. David smiled indulgently. "The plans we discussed, honey. The architects finalized everything last week." "What architects?" The room quieted. "I'm an architect, David. If anyone's designing anything on this property, it should be me." He laughed, that public laugh that always made me feel small. "Caroline, this is a major commercial development. We need professionals with large-scale experience." "Development?" my father interjected. "David, you said this was just family cabins." A flicker of annoyance crossed David's face. "Harold, the plans evolved. The market for luxury vacation properties in this area is booming. The Mitchell Oceanside Resort will put your company on the map internationally." "Resort?" I echoed. The room was completely silent now. "You're turning my grandfather's property into a resort?" "Our property," David corrected smoothly. "And it's just smart business." The trust assets were underperforming. This repositions everything for maximum return. My brother Michael frowned. "Wait, how are you financing this? The board hasn't approved any major capital expenditures." "Private investors," David replied. "All the paperwork's in order. Caroline and I have been planning this for years." All eyes turned to me. In that moment, I saw what had been happening with perfect clarity. David had been systematically looting my inheritance while positioning himself as the financial savior of the Mitchell family. And he expected me to smile and go along with it, just as I always had. "There must be some confusion," I said carefully, placing my napkin beside my plate. "I need to see these plans, now." "After dinner," David said firmly, his eyes warning me not to make a scene. Just then, Emma piped up from the far end of the table. "Dad, is that why you were fighting with that lady at the house in Chatham about the resort plans?" The room went still. David's face hardened. "What lady, sweetie?" "The pretty one with the red hair who was yelling at you last weekend when you said Mom was at her conference, but she was actually at Aunt Susan's gallery opening." I looked at my 12-year-old daughter, then at my husband. "Chatham House? We don't have a property in Chatham." David's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Emma's confused. We looked at an investment property there." "No," Emma insisted with adolescent certainty. "You said it was our special weekend place, and Mom doesn't need to know about everything. You said that a lot." I stood up abruptly. "David, I think we need to talk. In private." As I walked toward the study, I heard my father ask, "What's this about Chatham, David? That market's saturated." The tension that had been building for months, perhaps years, was about to break. What I didn't know was that the confrontation waiting behind that study door would lead directly to the courthouse moment that would change everything. 6 weeks after that disastrous Thanksgiving, I sat in Suffolk County Family Court, watching David's lawyer paint me as an incompetent socialite who'd neglected her fiduciary responsibilities while my brilliant husband saved the family fortune. The Mitchell name carried weight in Boston legal circles, and David had cultivated those connections for years. Mrs. Spencer had no interest in the financial details, his attorney argued, a tall woman with razor-sharp bangs and a Harvard law pedigree. She signed these documents willingly, as evidenced by her signatures. Mr. Spencer simply executed the vision they had discussed for years. Judge Harriman, a veteran of the bench with silver hair and perpetually tired eyes, glanced at me over his reading glasses. I sat beside my attorney, Peter Goldman, a former prosecutor recommended by Marianne, who specialized in financial fraud, not typical for divorce cases, which had raised David's suspicions from the start. "And now that these investments are about to bear fruit," David's lawyer continued, "Mrs. Spencer wants to claim she was uninformed? My client has increased the value of these assets by over 300%. He's entitled to his fair share, the $8.5 million representing his direct contribution to the growth of marital assets, plus the Cape Cod property which he developed." David sat there in his tailored navy suit, a practiced look of wounded reasonableness on his face. We hadn't spoken directly since that night in the study, when his explanations had dissolved into threats. "You'll get nothing if you fight me on this," he'd hissed after I confronted him about the Chatham House and the forged signatures. Who do you think the board will believe? The little girl who draws houses or the man who's doubled company profits? What followed was a calculated dismantling of my life. He froze our accounts, told my clients I was having emotional difficulties, and even convinced my father I was suffering from paranoid delusions. "She's never handled pressure well," I overheard him telling my father. "Remember how she collapsed during her thesis defense?" I hadn't collapsed. I'd had food poisoning and still completed my presentation. In the courtroom, David's attorney presented a final flourish, a psychiatric evaluation suggesting I suffered from financial anxiety and oppositional tendencies. I hadn't participated in that evaluation. The letterhead belonged to a colleague of David's college roommate. "Your Honor," David's attorney concluded, "Mr. Spencer is prepared to be generous regarding visitation with their daughter, but given Mrs. Spencer's instability, he is seeking primary custody along with the financial settlement outlined." Judge Harriman sighed. "Mr. Goldman, your response to these claims?" Peter stood, straightening his modest suit. "Your Honor, we've been patient. We've allowed opposing counsel to present a fictional narrative. Now, we'd like to present the truth, starting with this." He nodded to me, and I removed a manila folder from my briefcase, the culmination of 3 months of painstaking investigation. "Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I expected, "I request permission to approach." The judge looked surprised but nodded. As I walked forward, I felt David's eyes boring into my back. I placed the folder on the judge's bench. "This contains original bank records, notarized affidavits, and forensic accounting reports demonstrating that David Spencer has systematically defrauded not only me, but Mitchell Construction and multiple investors through a Ponzi scheme centered around the fictional Mitchell Oceanside Resort." The judge opened the folder, his expression changing as he scanned the first few pages. David stood abruptly. "Your Honor, my wife is clearly—" "Mr. Spencer, sit down," the judge said sharply. He turned back to me. "Mrs. Spencer, these are serious allegations. Where did you obtain these documents?" I took a deep breath. "The night of our Thanksgiving dinner, I searched David's office and found a key to a storage unit. Inside were backup hard drives containing all his financial records, the real ones, not the doctored versions he presented to me, my family, and apparently several investors." David's attorney jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, if these were obtained illegally—" "The storage unit was leased in my name," I said calmly. "David used my identity, just as he forged my signature on countless documents. The forensic handwriting analysis is on page 12. The judge flipped through the papers, his eyebrows rising. "There appears to be evidence of criminal activity here. This goes well beyond a divorce proceeding." David was on his feet again. "Caroline, don't do this. Think about Emma." I turned to face him directly for the first time. "I am thinking about Emma, and about the Mitchell name that my grandfather built, that you tried to steal. The SBI has copies of everything in that folder. They're executing search warrants at your office and the Chatham House as we speak." The color drained from David's face. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he pushed her away. "You stupid bitch," he hissed, forgetting where we were. "You have no idea what you've done. Your father signed off on everything. He'll go down too." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harriman's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Spencer, that's enough." But David was unraveling. 15 years I spent cleaning up your family's financial messes. Your father was over-leveraged and desperate when he brought me in. Who do you think saved Mitchell Construction after the 2008 crash? It wasn't your precious grandfather's legacy. It was me. "Bailiff," the judge called, "remove Mr. Spencer from my courtroom." As the bailiff approached, David lunged toward me. "Your father knew exactly what I was doing. Ask him about the offshore accounts." Peter stepped between us as the bailiff restrained David. Your Honor, I said, maintaining my composure while David was escorted out, his threats echoing down the hallway. There's more. Page 27 shows transfers to a shell company jointly owned by David Spencer and Judith Mitchell, my father's wife. I believe my father may be another victim, not an accomplice. As I returned to my seat, legs shaking but head high, the weight of 15 years of diminishment began to lift. The courtroom erupted in chaos behind me, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt the steel my grandmother had always said was inside me. The 72 hours following that courtroom revelation were a whirlwind. Federal agents swarmed David's office at Mitchell Construction, carting away boxes of documents and hard drives. The Chatham House, a $3.2 million property purchased in my name without my knowledge, was searched and sealed. David was arrested attempting to board a private plane at Hanscom Field with a suitcase containing $340,000 in cash and our daughter's passport alongside his own. Emma was with my mother when it happened, thankfully spared the sight of her father in handcuffs. Breaking the news to her was the hardest conversation of my life. "Is Dad a bad person?" she asked, curled against me on her childhood bed, surrounded by soccer trophies and science fair ribbons. "Your father made bad choices," I said carefully. "People are complicated, Em. They can love you completely and still do wrong things." "Did he ever really love us?" Her voice sounded so small. I brushed hair from her forehead. "I believe he did, in his way. But sometimes people get lost chasing what they think they need." The media descended like vultures, the Boston Globe running the headline, "Mitchell Construction Heir Accused in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme." Local news vans parked outside both the Brookline house and the Cape property. My brothers formed a protective barrier, fielding calls and managing the immediate PR crisis while I dealt with federal investigators. My father was another matter entirely. When I finally saw him 3 days later, he looked 20 years older, slumped in an armchair in his study, a half-empty tumbler of bourbon at his elbow. "Did you know?" I asked, remaining standing despite his gesture toward a chair. "Not everything," he said hoarsely. "Not the forgeries or the investor fraud, but I suspected he was moving money around in ways that weren't conventional. And you said nothing." He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "He was delivering results, Caroline. The company was growing. After the recession, we were hanging by a thread. Your grandfather's conservative approach had left us cash poor and asset rich in exactly the wrong economic climate. So you let David use my inheritance as collateral for risky investments. He promised he'd replace everything before you ever knew it was gone." My father's hand trembled as he reached for his glass. "I trusted him. He saved the company. By stealing from me, from investors, apparently even from his own daughter's future." "I didn't know about Emma's college fund," he said miserably. "You have to believe that." A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Marianne, who'd been coordinating with the forensic accountants. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you both need to see." She laid out documents on my father's desk, trusts, transfers, and a series of emails that revealed something neither of us had suspected. My father's wife, Judith, had been working with David from the beginning, before she'd even met my father. Their chance meeting at a charity gala had been orchestrated as part of David's longer game. "She targeted you," I said quietly, as my father stared at the evidence. "Just like David targeted me." My father put his head in his hands. "I've been such a fool, all these years." The investigation uncovered layer upon layer of deception. David and Judith had been systematically siphoning money from both the Mitchell family trust and the company, using increasingly complex financial instruments to hide their tracks. The Mitchell Oceanside Resort was merely the latest scheme, a way to convert misappropriated funds into seemingly legitimate development assets. What no one expected, least of all me, was the discovery of handwritten journals in David's storage unit. Detailed, calculating entries dating back to when my father first hired him, outlining his strategy to infiltrate the Mitchell family through the weak link, me. Target shows low self-esteem despite privileges, one early entry read. Father's obvious favoritism toward sons creates exploitable insecurity. Grandfather's trust makes her valuable despite father's dismissal. Reading those words broke something in me that I hadn't realized was still intact, some last shred of belief that at least our beginning had been real. But it also cauterized the wound. There was a strange relief in knowing that I hadn't failed at our marriage. I'd been selected for a long con. The unexpected twist came 6 weeks into the legal proceedings when my father suffered a minor stroke. As I sat beside his hospital bed, he squeezed my hand weakly. "I've been a terrible father to you," he said, "from the beginning. Dad, you should rest." He shook his head stubbornly. "Need to say this. Your grandfather, he saw what I couldn't, the way I treated you. That's why he set up the trust the way he did." "What do you mean?" "He told me right before he died, said, 'Harold, that girl has more Mitchell in her than all you boys combined, but you've been too blind to see it.'" He was right. 2 days later, my father signed papers removing himself as CEO of Mitchell Construction and appointing me as interim head until the board could vote on permanent leadership. "The company needs a Mitchell," he said, "and you're stronger than any of us." My brothers, surprisingly, supported the decision. Michael, who'd always been the expected heir, admitted he was better at building things than running them. "Besides," he added, "I've seen your work. You understand spaces and how people move through them. That's what we build, not just structures." Recovering the stolen assets became my mission over the next several months. Some were gone forever, laundered through offshore accounts or spent on David and Judith's lavish, secret life together. But through legal action and settlements, we managed to reclaim about 60% of what had been taken. The Cape House remained mine, untouched despite David's plans. I spent weekends there with Emma, slowly healing the breach his betrayal had created between us. One evening, as we walked along the shore collecting shells, she asked if we could still build something on the property. "Not a resort," she clarified quickly, "but maybe a small guest house where my cousins could stay, and Grandma when she visits." I looked at my daughter, so perceptive, so resilient despite everything, and saw the future of the Mitchell family standing before me. "I have some ideas," I said, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Maybe we could design it together." That summer, I reopened my architectural practice, focusing on sustainable commercial buildings while managing Mitchell Construction's transition. We specialized in projects that revitalized communities rather than just maximizing profit: community centers, mixed-income housing, and green urban spaces. The grand gesture that David had corrupted, the development of the Cape property, was reimagined. Instead of a resort, I designed a modest educational center focused on coastal ecology, dedicated to my grandfather's memory. The Mitchell Center for Environmental Studies opened 2 years after that fateful court hearing, built by Mitchell Construction and designed with input from Emma, who had discovered a passion for marine biology through our healing weekends by the sea. As for David, his trial ended with a 15-year federal sentence for fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Judith received 8 years for her role. The day his sentence was announced, I received a letter from him, pages of justifications and blame, ending with a demand to see Emma. I showed it to my daughter, now 14 and wise beyond her years. She read it carefully, then handed it back. "I'll visit him someday," she said, "when I'm ready. Not because he deserves it, but because I don't want anger to be part of who I am." In that moment, I saw that my daughter had inherited not just the Mitchell determination, but something entirely her own, a capacity for balanced justice that neither side of her family had managed to achieve. The true inheritance, I realized, wasn't the Cape House or the trust or even the family name. It was the resilience that allowed us to rebuild after devastation, to find meaning beyond mere survival. My grandmother had been right about Mitchell women being steel wrapped in silk, but the strength had always been mine, not just the family legacy. The courts eventually awarded me full restitution, though much of it would never be recovered. More importantly, I received full custody of Emma, with David permitted only supervised visits after his eventual release. The document I'd handed the judge that day had saved not just my inheritance, but my daughter's future and the Mitchell family's century-old reputation. Looking back now, 5 years after that day in court, I realize how completely my life has transformed. The Mitchell family business is thriving under a new model that balances profit with purpose. Emma is heading to college next fall, MIT for marine biology, secure and confident in ways I never was at her age. My father, partially recovered from his stroke, has become the grandfather he never managed to be as a parent, teaching Emma about building materials and structural integrity while respecting her own path. The Cape House remains our sanctuary, now expanded with the small guest house Emma and I designed together, her first architectural project. Sometimes, standing on the deck at sunset, I think about how close I came to losing everything my grandfather wanted me to have. Not just the property or the money, but the chance to discover my own strength. We all face moments when we must decide whether to accept what others tell us we deserve or stand up and claim what is rightfully ours. My moment came late, after years of diminishment, but it came nonetheless. The document I handed to that judge wasn't just evidence of fraud, it was a declaration of my own worth. If you're watching this and facing your own battle against someone who's undermining your value, remember that the truth has power, even when it's been buried under years of doubt. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find allies who see your worth clearly. And most importantly, know that you deserve to take up space in your own life. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel for more real-life accounts of people who found their voice when it mattered most. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your story matters too, and someone else might draw strength from knowing they're not alone. Remember, it's never too late to reclaim what's yours, whether it's property, reputation, or simply your sense of self-worth. The document that changes everything might be waiting for you to discover it.